I'm Vali Nasser, the Dean of Johns Hopkins University's School of Advanced International Studies, and it's my pleasure to welcome everybody to this event today. We meet just a few days shy of the 100-day mark for President Donald J. Trump's administration. The administration's agenda has been dominated for much of this time with domestic policy priorities such as healthcare, immigration, and job creation. But in the realm of foreign policy, there has been a lot happening as well, and there Asia looms large. Every U.S. administration since the 1970s has strongly emphasized the critical role of this region in American foreign policy. And since then, the overall importance of Asia on the global stage has only intensified. Already, the Trump administration has dealt with hot-button issues involving Asia, the protectionist trade policies to activities in the South China Sea, and now the Korean Peninsula. Yet clearly, the administration sees benefit in engaging Asia early on. President Trump hosted summits with Prime Minister Abe of Japan and President Xi Jinping of China. Vice President Mike Pence's Asia trip and a visit by Secretary of Defense James Mattis to Japan and South Korea also have signaled American intentions to diplomatically engage the region at the highest levels. Today, we offer a 100-day retrospective that aims to assess how the new American government has defined its foreign policy agenda in Asia and with what degree of success it has begun to implement it. This is the first major event hosted by SAIS Asia programs, and we are proud to co-sponsor it with Asia Society. And a special thanks to Wendy Cutler, the Vice President of Asia Society Policy Institute, for making this event possible. Thank you, Wendy. I would also like to thank the event's co-sponsors, the Johns Hopkins SAIS Reischauer Center for East Asia Studies and the U.S. Korea Institute for their generous support of this program. And now it's my great privilege to introduce Senator Cory Gardner. Senator Gardner is a fifth-generation Coloradan who was born and raised in Yuma, a small town in the eastern plains of Colorado, where his family owned a farm implementing dealership for over a century. He graduated summa cum laude from Colorado State University and received his law degree from the University of Colorado, Boulder. And after working at his family business and the National Corn Growers Association, he took a position as a legislative assistant to Senator Wayne Allard. He began serving in the Colorado House of Representatives in 2005, where he spent time as the minority whip and became known for his expertise in natural resources and agriculture policy. He was elected to the House of Representatives in 2010, and Senator Gardner served in the House Energy and Commerce Committee and led a number of energy efficiency initiatives and founded a bipartisan energy efficiency caucus. He was elected to the Senate in 2015, where he pursues common sense energy policy as a member of the Senate Energy and Natural Resource Committee and chairman of the Energy Subcommittee. In addition, Senator Gardner serves on the Foreign Relations Committee, the Commerce, Science, and Transportation Committee, and the Budget Committee. And he also serves as chairman of Foreign Relations Subcommittee on East Asia, the Pacific, and international cybersecurity policy. In this role, he has led the effort to impose broad new sanctions against North Korea. Senator Gardner, it is my honor to host you at Johns Hopkins SAIS. We look forward to your perspective on U.S.-Asia relations on the Trump administration and also hearing lessons learned from your illustrious career. Thank you and welcome to SAIS. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Nasser. Thank you to all of you for the opportunity to be here today. I am from a little tiny town in the eastern plains of Colorado, and most people in Colorado don't even really know where my hometown is. I have to explain to them it's the place that goes by on the bottom of the television screen, hailstorm coming, take cover. That usually narrows it down a little bit, but it was a unique experience in agricultural policy selling farm equipment. When I first ran for that state legislature in Colorado, I remember going around to eastern Colorado, introducing myself to people at the farm equipment dealership saying, "Hi, I'm Cory Gardner. I've met most of you at the farm dealership. I've sold half of you the wrong parts." Everybody started to shake their head, "Yes, you have." It made me feel really bad. So but thank you very much for the kind introduction. And thank you very much to the Asia Society Policy Institute, SAIS, as well, for hosting me here today. And thank you, Dr. Nasser, for the kind introduction. The opportunity to address this illustrious organization comes at an opportune time as President Trump approaches his 100 days, his first 100 days in office, and Vice President Pence has just completed what many observers would say are already calling it a very successful Asia reassurance tour to Japan, South Korea, Australia, and Indonesia. And I think the word reassurance is particularly a sweet note, and I'll talk a little bit about that more, but in a sense, to put it this way, the administration's reassurance or reaffirmation of unequivocal U.S. commitment to some of our strongest allies in this region. Now, that is the most welcome news of this visit, as well as the announcement that President Trump will attend both the U.S.-ASEAN Summit and the East Asia Summit in the Philippines and APEC Summit in Vietnam. As Woody Allen once said, 90% of life is showing up. And that certainly is the case in the Asia-Pacific and the signal our allies were eagerly awaiting. Today, I will address what I believe should be the Trump administration's most urgent priorities in Asia, and to also outline legislative initiatives that I am leading and working with this administration over the past 100 days, so that over the next several months in Congress, we can continue to strengthen our policies in this critical region that will benefit U.S. national and economic security. And I believe the most urgent challenge for U.S. policy in the region has defined much of the last several months in the region, of course, is the coming nuclear crisis on the Korean Peninsula. Last year alone, North Korea conducted 2 nuclear tests and a staggering 24 ballistic missile launches. All indications from our intelligence community is that Pyongyang is ready to test again one day, any day. Kim Jong-un is committed to developing his nuclear and missile program with one goal in mind: to have a reliable capability to deliver a nuclear warhead to Seoul, Tokyo, and to the continental United States. It is his lone path to regime stability in his mind. President Trump has said that the United States will not allow that to happen, and I am encouraged by the president's resolve over the past 100 days. I believe the U.S. policy toward North Korea should be straightforward. The United States will deploy every and all economic, diplomatic, and if necessary, military tool at our disposal to deter Pyongyang and to protect our allies. As Vice President Pence stated last week during his visit to South Korea, since 1992, the United States and our allies have stood together for a denuclearized Korean peninsula. We hope to achieve this objective through peaceable means, but all options are on the table. However, the road to stopping Pyongyang undoubtedly lies through Beijing. China is the only country that holds both the diplomatic and economic leverage necessary to put the pressure, the maximum pressure, on the North Korean regime. Beijing's reluctance to do so, however, is the reason the regime acts so boldly and with relatively few consequences. China must now move beyond mere articulation of concern and lay out a transparent path of focused pressure to denuclearize North Korea. The administration is right to pursue a policy of its own maximum pressure toward North Korea, and we have a robust toolbox to ramp up the sanctions track. Last Congress, I led the North Korea Policy and Sanctions Enhancement Act, which passed the Senate by a vote of 96-0. This legislation was the first standalone legislation in Congress regarding North Korea to impose mandatory sanctions on the regime's proliferation activities, its human rights violations, and its malicious cyber behavior. The administration must fully enforce this legislation, including imposing secondary sanctions on any Chinese entities that are aiding Pyongyang. In addition, we must pressure China to faithfully implement all UN Security Council resolutions with regard to North Korea, particularly Resolutions 2270 and 2321 negotiated last year, which require China to drastically reduce coal imports from North Korea. China's record in this regard has been lackluster, and they must prove their commitment through their action. China should also stop being complicit in the labor abuses of Pyongyang and shut off avenues of North Korean cyber attacks. Last month, China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi called on the United States and South Korea to halt their annual joint military exercises in exchange for North Korea suspending its missile and nuclear activities, a deal that the Trump administration rightly rejected. We must let Beijing know that the United States will not negotiate with Pyongyang at the expense of our security of our allies. Moreover, before any talks, we must demand that Pyongyang first meet the denuclearization commitments that it had already agreed to and subsequently chose to discard. President Trump should unequivocally condemn the economic pressure exerted by Beijing with Seoul over the deployment of the Terminal High Altitude Area Defense, or THAAD, on South Korean territory. THAAD is a defensive system, and it in no way threatens China, and Beijing knows this. Most importantly, President Trump should continue to indicate to President Xi that a denuclearized Korean peninsula is in both nations' fundamental long-term interests. But to achieve this goal, Beijing must be made to choose whether it wants to work with the United States as a responsible leader to stop the madman in Pyongyang, or bear and acknowledge the consequences of keeping him in power. Another looming crisis in the region is the escalation of tensions in the East and South China Seas. China's recent destabilizing actions in the East China Sea and South China Sea are contrary to international law, pose an increased risk of future conflict, and necessitate a strong U.S. and regional response. Their actions seem at odds with their words. China has declared an illegitimate air defense identification zone in the East China Sea and has dramatically expanded its land reclamation activities in the South China Sea and its clear militarization. Since 2013, according to the Department of Defense, China has reclaimed over 3,200 acres of artificial features in the South China Sea. On July 12, 2016, an international tribunal in The Hague ruled that China violated the sovereignty of the Philippines with regard to maritime disputes between the two nations. China has also built facilities with potential military uses on these artificial islands. We've seen the pictures, including 3 airstrips and hangars that could shelter fighter jets, harbors, anti-aircraft batteries, radars, as well as structures that could house surface-to-air missiles. Last month, the Center for Strategic and International Studies Asia Maritime Transparency Initiative reported, and I quote, "Major construction of military and dual-use infrastructure on the Big Three, Subi, Mischief, and Fiery Cross Reefs is wrapping up, with the naval, air, radar, and defense facilities largely complete. Beijing can now deploy military assets, including combat aircraft and mobile missile launchers, to the Spratly Islands at any time." The United States must have consistent and assertive diplomatic engagement with China to reinforce that these rogue activities fall outside of accepted international norms. More is expected of a great nation. The U.S. defense posture in this region should remain exactly what Secretary of Defense Ashton Carter said at the Shangri-La Dialogue in Singapore on May 30th, 2015. The United States will fly, sail, and operate wherever international law allows, as U.S. forces do all over the world. America, alongside its allies and partners in the regional architecture, will not be deterred from exercising these rights, the rights of all nations. A consistent, deliberate, and assertive policy to do just that is imperative. Last May, while I attended the Shangri-La Dialogue, I heard a tremendous amount of concern from the region's top leaders regarding U.S. presence in the Asia-Pacific region and our commitment to remaining engaged in this critical part of the world. The Trump administration is inheriting an Asia rebalance policy from the previous administration, which was right in rhetoric, but ultimately came up short on meaningful actions. The Asia pivot was a good turn of phrase, but it never resulted in an actual turn to Asia. The new administration and the new Congress ushers a new era of opportunities with regard to U.S. policy toward the Asia Pacific. But despite the political changes in Washington, the U.S. policy imperatives will remain the same. The Asia Pacific region has been and will be critical to U.S. economic and national security interests for generations to come. By 2050, you're going to talk about it throughout today, experts estimate that Asia will account for over half of the global population and over half of the world's gross domestic product. We cannot ignore the fundamental fact that this region is crucial and critical for a U.S. economy, its growth, and to create U.S. jobs through export opportunities. Last month, I held a hearing in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Subcommittee on East Asia and Pacific. And of course, the full committee, as Dr. Nasser outlined, is the East Asia Pacific and International. It would never fit on a bumper sticker. It may fit on the whole bumper, but not quite a bumper sticker. But held the hearing, which I chaired, and we had Randy Forbes, a former member of Congress from Virginia and chair of the House Armed Services Subcommittee on Sea Power and Projection Forces, testify before the committee, in which he said this: in the coming decades, this region, where the largest armies in the world will camp, this is the region where the most powerful navies in the world will gather. This is the region where over 1/2 of the world's commerce will take place, and 2/3 will travel. This is the region where a maritime superhighway linking the Indian subcontinent, Southeast Asia, Australia, Northeast Asia, and the United States begins. This is the region where two superpowers will compete to determine which world order will prevail. This is the region where the seeds of conflict that could most engulf the world will probably be planted. This is why I'm pursuing legislation that I call the Asia Reassurance Initiative Act, a new approach, or ARIA, a new approach that will build on American interests, first by reassuring our allies, deterring our adversaries, and securing U.S. leadership in the region for future generations. ARIA will pursue three broad goals. First, it will strengthen U.S. security commitments to our allies and build partner capacity in the Asia-Pacific to deter aggression, project power, and combat terrorism. To do so, the ARIA will authorize funds to bolster U.S. military presence in the region, grow partner nation maritime capabilities to deter aggression in their territorial waters, and to build new counterterrorism partnership programs in Southeast Asia to combat the growing presence of ISIS and other terrorist organizations. ARIA will also enshrine a policy of regularly enforcing U.S. freedom of navigation and overflight rights in the East and South China Seas. We will reaffirm our long-standing treaty alliances with Australia, South Korea, Japan, and call for building new regional security partnerships. We will unequivocally back our ally Taiwan, including authorizing new arms sales and provide for enhanced diplomatic contacts with Taipei. Second, ARIA will promote economic engagement and securing U.S. market access in the Asia-Pacific region as essential elements for the future growth of the U.S. economy and success of American businesses. To do so, ARIA will also require that the Trump administration find new and innovative ways to economically engage the region. We will mandate that the United States government enhance our trade facilitation efforts and opportunities for U.S. businesses to find new export markets in the Asia-Pacific. U.S.-made exports to Asia will mean more good-paying American jobs at home, and that's a win-win that we can all support. We also ensure that there is a level playing field for U.S. companies, including cracking down on state-sponsored and state-endorsed theft of U.S. intellectual property in the region. According to a report by the Intellectual Property Commission, this is a report that was chaired by Admiral Dennis Blair, the former U.S. commander of Pacific Command, and John Huntsman, the former ambassador to China. Theft of U.S. intellectual property is estimated at over $300 billion annually, and China accounts for about 50 to 80% of that amount. China must understand that this behavior with regard to the massive and well-documented theft of foreign international property is unacceptable and antithetical to international norms. Third, ARIA will enshrine promotion of democracy, human rights, and transparency as key U.S. policy objectives in the Asia-Pacific region, particularly in Southeast Asia. A pillar of any nation that seeks a prosperous future and a future with a strong relationship with the United States must be individual freedoms. As President Kennedy once stated, the rights of every man are diminished when the rights of one man are threatened. So from Manila to Rangoon, we should advocate for principled policies that emphasize accountability and transparency as indispensable elements of building any security or economic partnerships with the United States. To inform my initiative, I have met with numerous key stakeholders in Congress and spent many weeks and months talking to the administration over the last several months and going forward, also building and holding a series of hearings in my subcommittee, the first of which took place last month. I look forward to working with all of you to advance this initiative, and I certainly welcome your input moving forward. The stakes for the Trump administration and the United States could not be higher in the U.S. Pacific region. The fundamental question is whether it will be the United States or China that will set the standards for the next generation. China's recent destabilizing actions are proving that its rise may be less than peaceful. And it's imperative that the United States show strong leadership to check Beijing's worst impulses. Putting Asia at front and center for U.S. policy is putting America first, because our future national and economic security depends on it. I want to thank Dr. Nasser SAIS for the opportunity to be with you today, and I'm happy to answer questions going forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator Gardner. I think we've all been impressed and stirred and enlightened by your remarks. We have time for about 3 questions. Senator Gardner would like to take those questions together. So please, anyone who would like to, please raise your hands. Okay, we first of all, right in the back, in the middle there.
Hi, thank you. Hi, I'm Megan Casella with Politico. I wondered if you could detail at all, you've mentioned you've been talking with the administration about ARIA and presumably other issues as well. If you could detail at all their reaction, particularly in light of the economic engagement, the idea that the U.S. should economically engage China and other Asian nations as well. Thanks.
Okay, thanks very much. Another question right here.
Ben Self from the Maureen and Mike Mansfield Foundation. Very strong remarks about North Korea, which we strongly endorse, but we always worry about leaving some path for them to compromise and work a way out and not just force into confrontation or violence. So what do you see as the right path for them to be able to back away from this decades-long trajectory towards nuclear deterrence and provide maybe even a small carrot to lead them away from that disaster? Thank you.
Thanks very much. And then right here.
Ken Meyerberg, retiree. Who do you suppose ordered the meandering of the USS Carl Vinson, and what have been the repercussions?
Thank you very much, and so I'll address these 3 questions. When it comes to ARIA, I think the reaction has been very positive. We've spent time both at the State Department as well as visiting with the White House itself about ARIA and the 3 sort of pillars of the legislation from a security standpoint, from an economic standpoint, from a strengthening human rights and democracy standpoint. We've met with various think tanks around Washington, Asia policy centers and studies, leaders in Asia, both in terms of economic issues as well as national security experts when it comes to Asia. The economic engagement is a critical part of this. We've also met with economic leaders, industries around the country when it comes to ARIA. And the economic portion of the bill will, of course, be one of the key pillars, one of the key 3 pillars of the legislation. I do believe that trade with Asia is incredibly important, and Vice President Pence was right to discuss that in Asia, talking about ways to build those trade opportunities. And I think that's how we need to move forward as expeditiously as possible, and ARIA will help focus that. What we have to move beyond in Asia is either catchphrases that sound good but in reality don't result in anything, and we have to move beyond 4- and 8-year thought processes as we look at Asia and move to a 40-year strategy. That's something that Secretary Tillerson has talked about. That's something that Asia Initiative is trying to embrace, a long-term view of how we build that capacity, that partnership, opportunities, and security in a nuts-to-bolts, soup-to-nuts kind of approach in Asia from the north to the south in a comprehensive manner. When it comes to North Korea, look, there was an article, I think, in the news yesterday by David Cohen, who was Undersecretary over at Treasury at terrorist finance sanctions issues. And I think he talked about the comparison between Iran and North Korea when it comes to the amount of sanctions that have been put in place on North Korea. And his point was basically that we have not sanctioned out North Korea, not by any means at all. And so when we look to North Korea, I think there's a couple things that we have to do that we haven't even scratched the surface on, and that is making sure that those enablers of the North Korean regime outside of North Korea need to be held accountable. Secondary sanctions have an extremely important role in the ability to bring Kim Jong-un and break him away from his path toward nuclearization. And so that means that we take a look at, under our legislation that we passed last year, the North Korea Sanctions Enhancement Act, those investigations into violations are mandatory. If there is a finding of a violation, the sanction is mandatory unless there is an individualized waiver from the president. But we have to turn toward these secondary sanctions as one of the most important tools in our toolbox that has not yet been exercised. We have to build our relationship strengthen our relationship between Japan and South Korea, build that trilateral alliance. It's one of the most important and effective tools, not only as it deals directly with North Korea, but as we deal with China and how we can use that trilateral alliance in partnership with China, because we all have the same stated objective, and that is peaceful denuclearization. The incentive should be to North Korea, we are not looking for anything other than peaceful denuclearization. And the incentive is to maybe change the paradigm, to change that photograph, that satellite image at night when you look at the Korean Peninsula and you can see the opportunities that South Korea has enjoyed for the past several decades as they have developed and grown in a quality of life standard that is the envy of many areas of the world, that they too in North Korea could participate in such opportunities if they break away from the dictates of the current regime, and at least if he gives up a nuclear program and is welcomed at the world table once again. The third question is the USS Vinson. Look, I wasn't a part of those discussions. I do think that communications are clear, but I mean the bottom line is we have a show of force that is necessary and important, and regardless of the timing, the fact is we have an important show of force with the Vinson and other capabilities and capacities of the United States, and I think that's important to show strength and commitment to South Korea, but also show ability to North Korea. So thanks very much to all of you for the opportunity to be with you today, and I look forward to hearing the results of the next panel of experts. You've got some incredible people. What a great fortune it is to have them here. So thank you.
So please join me in thanking the Senator. Thank you very much.
Well, first, thank you all for making it today. I'm Jake Schlesinger with the Wall Street Journal. I'll be moderating this discussion. A reminder to the audience, please turn off your cell phones, and to my fellow panelists, put your cell phones on airplane mode if you haven't yet, as we begin this flight of discussion through Asia. Whatever you think about the policies and directions of the Trump administration, I just want to start by saying it's been good for the business of journalists and analysts like those of us up here today. We were talking about this a little bit before with Dean Nasser, but it's hard to remember a time of such uncertainty about the direction of policy, and that places greater value, or so we like to think, for discussions like these. I just want to recount briefly that shortly after the election, I was asked to appear on a similar panel for the Japan-America Society of Washington to look ahead at what the Trump administration might hold in store for Japan and Asia. And at the time, and this was really a week or two after the vote, many of us were simply in shock about what had just happened and in a real fog about what lay ahead, myself included. So before getting on the stage, I walked around the audience during the dinner looking for the smartest people that I could pick out to pick their brains on what I should say. And among them was Kent Calder, who had some sage and prescient observations about how things may not be so dire after all. And there may actually be some opportunities for Japan in the new order. A prediction that seemed counterintuitive at the time, but was actually, it proved to be quite accurate, as we've seen in the early days of the surprising Don-Shinzo golfing relationship, among other things. I say all that by way of noting that we're privileged to have with us today for our panel discussion on U.S.-Asia relations in the Trump administration's first 100 days, Dr. Calder, to my immediate left, who is director here at the Reischauer Center for East Asian Studies, a specialist in the East Asian political economy, and one of the world's foremost experts on Japan. And we'll be joined by 4 other distinguished thinkers rounding out our group, going across the stage to my far left, your far right, Michael Swaine, a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, formerly a senior policy analyst at RAND and one of the top experts on China security studies, who directs security-related projects with Chinese partners and advises the U.S. government on Asian security matters. To my immediate right, Wendy Cutler, Vice President and Managing Director of the Asia Society Policy Institute, previously a longtime diplomat and negotiator at the U.S. Trade Representative's Office, where her accomplishments included negotiating the late great Trans-Pacific Partnership, which I expect we will talk a lot about here today. Next, Richard Fontaine, President of the Center for New American Security, an Asian foreign policy veteran who's seen policy making from nearly every angle, with stints at the State Department, the National Security Council, the Senate, and a presidential campaign as foreign policy advisor to John McCain's 2008 bid. And Joshua White at the far end, a professor in South Asia Studies at SAIS, with stints under his belt at the National Security Council and the Pentagon. So here's how this is all going to unfold. We're going to talk up here amongst ourselves for about an hour, and then we're going to open it up to questions from the audience for about half an hour. We're going to aim to wrap up a little bit before noon. And a reminder now, in case I forget to tell you later, that at that point, you should have all gotten meal tickets. You can go out back around noon to get your meal, and please come back here precisely at 12:30 for the afternoon session. So I'd like to kick things off by asking each of the panelists to open with a kind of lightning round of brief answers to this two-part question. From the standpoint of U.S.-Asia relations, what has been the single most important development so far in the Trump administration's first 100 days? Actually, we're still at 96 as of today. And B, what is the single most important thing to watch in the next 100 days? We can get into each point in more depth later, but this is just to help quickly set the agenda for this conversation. Just a few seconds briefly from each of you. A, most important developments so far, and then B, most important things to watch for in the coming months. And let's start at this end with you, Michael.
Well, I'd say probably the most important development so far is that many of the worst case thinking or assumptions about what the Trump administration policy would do in Asia have not materialized yet.
Okay, that's a good, and looking forward, we'll look to see those materialize? Is that?
Well, looking forward, I would say that obviously the most critical issue is North Korea and the handling of the North Korean situation. And there we see a, to my mind, not very clear policy of how to deal with this problem on the part of the Trump administration, with signals being sent out in various directions, but not ones that I would regard as necessarily very reassuring, and a reliance on the Chinese solving this problem, which I doubt very much is going to be the case.
Thank you. Kent.
I think probably the most significant was the U.S.-Japan summit. It was the first of the major meetings relating to Asia. Certainly, there's a lot of questions remaining. Absolutely, it was rather general in many ways, but I think that because it was first, it set some leverage for other meetings, set some important agendas, and the basic structure of the Pence-Oso dialogue that involves macro, micro sectoral, which is certainly important, but a U.S.-Japan cooperative agenda as well. I think that was well configured.
And looking forward, what's the most important thing to watch on your agenda?
I think one crucial thing is going to be the elections in Korea on May 9th. There are many issues outstanding, certainly the strategically important THAAD dialogue, the ability of the U.S., Japan, and Korea to cooperate also could well hang on the results there.
Great, thank you. Wendy?
Well, first I just want to say that while the Trump presidency has been great for journalists, it's been great for former trade negotiators as well. Probably the most significant development on the trade front has been the U.S. withdrawal from TPP. And even though a lot of our Asian partners, both who are in TPP and not in TPP, should have expected it based on everything that was said on the campaign trail, I think they were surprised. I think they really thought that somehow the U.S. would find a way forward on this negotiation. When I look ahead, I think of all the work and initiatives and executive orders that have been launched in the trade area, and a lot of them are going to need to show results in the next 100 days or the coming months, including our new dialogue on economic issues with China, including launching officially the NAFTA negotiations, including the outcome of the trade deficit study, as well as other studies, and of course, the steel import investigation.
Richard?
Yeah, I would say the most important development thus far are the dogs that didn't bark relative to the campaign rhetoric. So instead of saying that Japan and Korea had to pay 100% of host nation support, that we didn't mind whether they went nuclear, that our commitment to their defense would turn in part on how much they paid for American support, all of that's gone away, and the president said he's 100% behind Japan, 100% behind Korea. Mike Pence and Jim Mattis have made reassurance tours out there, and you've seen a pretty dramatic shift. Looking forward, I would say you have some potential converging lines of challenge in the U.S.-China relationship. You've got, over the next 100+ days, you've got potentially increased movement on the deployment of THAAD in South Korea. You've got these trade reviews that China's going to get sort of mixed up in. You've got the potential to sanction Chinese entities doing business in North Korea. And then you've got the 19th Party Congress this fall, after which Xi Jinping will have more flexibility, presumably, in his foreign policy. And so how that all nets out, I think, is the thing to watch.
Okay. From South Asia?
I think the most important development in South Asia has been the beginning of a very serious Afghanistan review. The conflict in Afghanistan is what many in the press have called a deteriorating stalemate, and deteriorating stalemates don't remain stalemates forever. I think the new administration realizes this. Trump said that he wants to start winning. And so the administration is taking a close look at this. And I would say this is not just an Afghanistan story, this is an Asia story. Countries from India to Japan have invested millions of dollars in Afghan stability. The terrorism problems in Afghanistan have had reach into China, Sri Lanka, as far as Southeast Asia. And if the United States decides to plus up the troop presence in Afghanistan in a serious way, that will draw what the Pentagon calls high-demand, low-density assets that would be used in other contingencies around the world. So there are global implications for what happens in Afghanistan. Now, what's most important looking forward, I think it's not Afghanistan, but it's the U.S.-India relationship. Prime Minister Modi is probably visiting here this summer. And the United States has long predicated its relationship with India on a strategic calculation that we may not get much in the near term, but we're making a strategic bet on India over the long term for geopolitical reasons. That strategic framing is now being challenged by the Trump administration's approach on a range of issues that's much more transactional. So the key question is, how can the Trump administration bring a transactional approach to the India relationship? And I think we'll see a few things that you should be watching: what happens on defense and counterterrorism, on border security, where it's a major issue here in the United States and for the Indians, and finally on energy, where there's the possibility of a significant LNG play between the United States and India in the coming months.
Great. Well, thank you all very much. I think that sets the agenda really, really well for the conversation. And I'd actually like to start by playing off something that Josh raised, and I think probably a lot of people here can talk about that, which is beyond any specific alliance, there is a lot of talk of this administration sort of changing the basic framework for how it deals with Asia and alliances more broadly, using what you called the transactional approach as opposed to the sort of regional approach or the broader alliance approach. And I'd like to hear, maybe you could start, and then if anyone else wants to jump in, people to talk about how much they've seen of that so-called transactional approach and how that may change the way the U.S. relates to Asia in good and or bad ways. So.
Sure. Well, I'll just say, as the Indians look forward to a leader-level visit, which takes months of planning and effort on deliverables, I think the natural model would be to look at Abe's very successful visit to Washington. And unfortunately for the Indians, they can't bring what Abe brought. Not only does Modi not play golf, which is a handicap of some kind, but India is a capital-seeking country. It's not in a position to bring promises of manufacturing, capital, or jobs. And so they have to seek out other kinds of transactional deals. And I think they'll be looking more aggressively to things in the security space, where they can make pledges to cooperate on counter-ISIL or on other things of global concern, and try to sidestep some of the more contentious issues related to services that have plagued the U.S.-India relationships. It's going to take a lot more creativity to provide a deal when India doesn't have the capital to bring to the table like some other U.S. partners do.
So, yeah, go ahead, please.
I was just going to say, I mean, we talk about a transactional dimension to Trump foreign policy because Trump touts his great deal-making ability. And I haven't seen much evidence of any of that. I've seen actions and things been said by Trump, for example, seeking to link one China to trade issues, which collapsed. The idea of originally naming China as a currency manipulator of day one to the point where we are now, where he says we don't want to do that. In fact, they're not manipulating the currency, and we don't want to do it because we need their help on North Korea. So that sounds like a transaction where the Chinese have more leverage than the United States does. And then, of course, you have the problem that the idea of being a transactional president who can make deals on an ad hoc basis is not exactly reassuring to Asian powers. Japan has, I think, concerns in some quarters that right now Trump's desire to develop relations with China coming out of the Mar-a-Lago summit earlier this month is going to lead to his wanting to make deals with China that could possibly be done at Japan's expense. So the transactional aspects of all this, to me, are problematic.
I think it depends very much on the country and also on the kind of preparations that are involved. The benefit, I suppose, of a transactional approach, if any, is that it focuses the discussion in a way that rather general talk about principles might not. Conversely, of course, there's the downside of that too. Will it focus, for example, on issues relating to U.S. domestic economic development or cooperation on technology, cybersecurity or robotics or whatever, or energy efficiency that Senator Gardner just raised? I think in the U.S.-Japan case, there certainly is that potential. If a country has deep ties, economic ties with the U.S., they have something to provide in a transaction if it's focused. Obviously, there's a lot of downsides. Michael's pointed, I think, well to some of them.
I think, Wendy, I wanted to turn to you for a minute because I know you've got strong views on one of the early views on the transaction, which was when President Trump said, actually, it was an interview with the Wall Street Journal where he said, we won't push China as hard on the trade deficit as we would have because we need their help on North Korea. Talk a little bit about your views on how you think that plays out in the region.
Yeah, I think it was very surprising to people on both sides of the Pacific. Basically, he said that, China may get a better deal on trade if it cooperates more with North Korea. If you're an ally of the United States like Japan or Korea, how do you interpret that kind of statement? Does that mean that they'll also get an easier deal on trade if they cooperate? Of course, it's kind of a different equation. Also, I think it raises questions about what the president may be willing to trade to get something else. And this time, maybe he said trade. Next time, it may be the South China Sea. I mean, who knows? And so I think that raised some alarm bells. I would also suspect that if some of President Trump's supporters who really feel strongly about the trade issue and creating jobs in the U.S. and really feel that China has since China's entered the global trading system under its WTO accession, has taken jobs away from America, I think it's quite surprising to them as well that he would suggest that he'll go easier on China on trade because of their cooperation on North Korea. So I was surprised by the statement. I know this president is transactional, and based on his background, that's how he sees things. But I think when you become president, statements like that can lead to a lot of misunderstanding and, frankly, problems down the road. Finally, I would just say expectations from China with regard to what that statement means. Does that mean that we're cooperating on North Korea, so therefore you're not going to label us a trade deficit country and force us to enter into trade negotiations? Or did the president mean, no, I've been easy on you on trade because I didn't call you a currency manipulator? So once again, I think statements like that are, raising concerns on both sides of the Pacific.
Richard, I know you wanted to jump in. Sorry.
Yeah, I would just say I think when on the question of transactionalism, you have to distinguish among the countries you're talking about, and alliances are under themselves. Alliances are not transactions. They're insurance policies against threats that may or may not ever materialize, and so you make commitments to each other that outlast any particular transaction. And I think with respect to the alliances, you see the administration sort of almost immediately after it's taken office sort of going to that line, irrespective of the rhetoric before that. So when you talk about Japan and Korea and Australia and the other alliances, you see that. I think there's other relationships, however, when we actually could use some more transactionalism. I think India is a good example of this. For decades, a couple decades now, quite rightly, American presidents, Republican and Democratic, have been putting capital in the diplomatic bank with India, supporting India's aspirations on the UN permanent membership in the UN Security Council, the civilian nuclear deal with India, lifting export control restrictions, et cetera, with expecting nothing concrete in return. But if you do that indefinitely, you don't build the constituency on our side that it's going to help that relationship last longer. And so I think a little more transactionalism could actually give some ballast in that particular relationship.
Thank you. I'd like to delve in a bit more into North Korea, as that's kind of the main issue that has hung over the region since President Trump has taken office, from the early summit with Prime Minister Abe, where their last night was interrupted by the North Korean missile launch, and they had that somewhat strange joint press conference, to obviously ongoing deliberations. I guess, I don't know, Michael, if you want to start and talk a little bit more about sort of assessing what the Trump strategy has been so far on North Korea, and what are your concerns, or where do you think that they may be improving things from how the previous administration had handled things?
Well, I think the Trump strategy thus far is an effort to try to primarily, while reassuring Seoul, reassuring Tokyo, try to work with the Chinese for them to put more pressure on North Korea to agree up front to denuclearize and then presumably open some kind of talks to that end. And the Trump administration has sought to do this by sending signals in one area that are, and saying that everything's on the table, right, over and over and over again, all options are on the table. And you've got the Trump administration sending signals of various sorts that indicate that they mean business in terms of the possibility of using the military in some way, shape, or form to address this issue, while at the same time having diplomats associated with the Trump administration, senior officials, more junior officials, say, our emphasis is on talking, our emphasis is on trying to get a peaceful development here. So the idea, I assume, is the notion to indicate that there's a certain time period where we're going to try diplomacy, and we're going to really try to get the North Koreans to behave. But if that doesn't happen, who knows what we'll do.
And what would you say is the fundamental difference between the Trump and Obama approaches, and how would you handicap the prospects of the Trump administration's ability to succeed where the Obama administration did not?
I think the biggest difference is simply in the visibility and the stridency of the statement that all options are on the table and we could use military force to try to convey to the Chinese in a much more palpable way that the United States is fed up and at the end of its rope, and it's capable of doing some things that it hasn't considered before in a serious way in dealing with North Korea. I think that's probably the biggest difference. Many people point to that and say, well, that's critical. That's the key thing. That's going to make all the difference. And we have no serious indication that that will, in fact, make all the difference in terms of actually achieving the objective desired. It could, and it probably will, make the Chinese more emphatic in dealing with North Korea in order to get them not to test in the near term. Many people expected we might have had a test on the 15th, might have had a test today. These are both anniversaries. And we still might have a test, a nuclear test. They fired off artillery shells today, the North Koreans, to long-range artillery to indicate that they have the capability to hit Seoul, which they do. So there's no indication that the ultimate objective here is being advanced by doing this. And I think that the option of using force in the North Korean case, particularly direct force against North Korea, is a totally self-defeating option, which will not lead to the kind of objective that some people might hope to have. So I think what's needed in this is a much more serious, longer-term strategy that talks about how you get to a freeze and then a cap, and ultimately denuclearization through a combination of policies that include positive and negative incentives aimed at both the North Koreans and the Chinese.
I think there's an important high-risk, high-reward aspect to this. Certainly more in terms of pressure. How will North Korea respond? In the longer term, of course, there are some important questions. There's more risk. I think it's important to point to something that President Obama actually initiated. I think quite a far-sighted notion of cyber, the cyber dimension of this relationship. Of course, it doesn't involve direct attacks. We've seen lots of failures recently in the Musadan program. That dimension, of course, it may mean that we'll see some cyber escalation. We already had the attack on Sony Pictures, of course. But the cyber dimension, I suppose, could continue to be more important. Another aspect Michael didn't mention, Southeast Asia. They've had long relationships with North Korea, diplomatic relations. We saw that Kim Jong-un's half-brother was killed down there. Pressure in terms of those relationships, no doubt, is escalating. I think the Trump administration is also stressing that. Those are, in some sense, new developments, building on the Obama cyber dimension. I think those will be important, and they don't necessarily involve military escalation.
Just one point that Richard mentioned earlier about alliances. I think something that is a very positive development is you see the president and his team on the telephone with our allies almost on a daily basis on this issue. And I think that's a result from the good summit meetings that he had with Prime Minister Abe and with President Xi. I think that has, definitely contributed to maybe a calming on this issue among our alliance partners, others.
Yeah, I would just say, I think the administration, if it hasn't yet, at least internally, is going to have to clarify very precisely what its actual objective is with North Korea. The long-term objective publicly will always be nuclearization. They should give up all of their nuclear weapons, turn them over, and we'll dismantle them, which is not going to happen. And if you look at it from the Kim regime perspective, Saddam Hussein and Muammar Gaddafi did not have weapons of mass destruction. Look where they ended up, and the Iranians did, or were in the process of getting a program toward there, and they got a nuclear deal with economic benefits and all these other kinds of things. I mean, the idea that they would give up their last deterrent in exchange for a deal on heavy fuel oil or whatever it is that we might imagine, more integration into the international community is just unfathomable. Now that said, we might be able to get to a freeze, but the question is the objective a freeze? Is it a freeze of both the nuclear and the missile programs in exchange for what? And is there a regime change component to this? Are we going to start talking to the Chinese about what a post-Kim Korean Peninsula would look like, including what implications that might have for the American force posture in Korea? Those are conversations the Chinese have not wanted to have with us for pretty obvious reasons. It's a totally different kind of path than the one that everyone seems to be focused on. What is the right combination of carrots and sticks that will sort of get the Chinese to fix it for us or get the North Koreans to come around? But I think that those possibilities are pretty small at this point.
Just getting back to something that I had alluded to at the outset, I mean, one of the defining traits of the Trump administration, I think across the board, is unpredictability. And I wonder how, I mean, in a way, some people have joked or maybe half joked that you now have for the first time in this equation, a U.S. leader who may be as unpredictable, if not more so, than the North Korean leader. And I wonder how, if at all, you think that prospect sort of changes the equation, if at all, dealing with North Korea and across Asia more broadly. Is it a real thing, and is it possible that works better in getting concessions, or does that blow up on our face in a dangerous way. Oh, go ahead, Ken.
I think there's an important distinction between public unpredictability and continuity in terms of the policy process. And of course, the policy process itself is, by its nature, more opaque. That, I would say, particularly the continuity.
We're talking about in Washington.
In relations with our partners in the Pacific or other countries. There's where, for example, in the U.S.-Japan, U.S.-Korea, U.S.-Australia, some of the alliance relations, particularly the, who happens to be in place in defense or state or NSC, those kind of things, or NEC, I think, which could be important in many of them. Those things are really the most important. And I'm just hoping that, of course, many positions aren't filled, but we will get predictability at that level. I think that's really key.
Yeah, I'll just add, allies don't like unpredictability, and unpredictability in terms of our commitments to allies is generally not a good idea. In fact, and when you're talking about deterrence, unpredictability tends to not be a good idea. If you intend to actually take action against something, you should be pretty clear about what that thing is and what you're likely to do in response. There's other areas, though, where unpredictability can be helpful. In the U.S.-China relationship, it has been the Chinese that have been injecting unpredictability into the relationship now for the past few years in the South China Sea and establishing the Air Defense Identification Zone and a number at cyber and a number of other areas. And it's been the United States that's tried to always be there, be the predictable one, all this other stuff. And what that has resulted in part, is the Chinese being able to move forward on a number of different areas where our pushback is sort of utterly predictable. And I think injecting some unpredictability into that relationship could put the Chinese in a more defensive position. Now, that alone is not going to solve problems, but it can be a useful adjunct to it.
If I could add just one, to a certain degree, I think not telegraphing everything that you're thinking and intending to do is of some benefit. But if you're going to deliberately pursue unpredictability, you better know what it is that you can actually follow through on and what you can't. Unpredictability often involves laying out certain objectives that are extreme, and they tend to be opposite. And you send signals in confusing ways to indicate, are you going to lean this way, or are you going to lean that way? If you're going to play that game, you need to understand that if the other side calls your bluff in a particular way, you are prepared to do certain things. And you think they'll be effective, and they will be effective. And I think that's a very problematic option in some respects when you deal with the Chinese situation. Because in many respects, the Chinese have as much leverage in various issues as the United States has, particularly in the economic arena.
I'd like to key off a couple of things that were just talked about. One is, which Kent had alluded to, and something we had talked about on one of our earlier conversations, and I'll invite anybody to jump in, which is, one thing to keep in mind in assessing the first 100 days and looking ahead is that compared to other administrations, this one is still very lightly staffed, particularly in the Asia area. That there are a lot of positions that are unfilled, and would invite one of you to sort of just review where we're at and what we don't know, even in terms of who's going to be shaping these policies.
Well, the most senior Asia specialists in the administration seem to be the acting Assistant Secretary Susan Thornton, who is carried over from the Obama administration, and Matt Pottinger, who is the Asia National Security Council Director. And the rest of the positions, I think I don't know if they filled the Assistant Secretary position in the Defense Department yet or not.
They have not nominated someone, but they have someone.
Yeah,
on
have
deck,
somebody in mind, but they haven't actually. So it's really a skeleton crew. And when you're trying to develop these policies that are supposed to be relatively effective and to some degree need to be sophisticated, you need to have people in there who really know what they're doing, who have some history and some knowledge of the situation in a meaningful way, and who can work together effectively. And if you're excessively reliant on one or two people, and one of them being a holdover who may not be in the position for very much longer, and the same thing for some of the people on the National Security Council, then the ability to really implement policy becomes questionable. But I mean, I just wonder whether or not that Trump has any real intention of filling these positions.
I would agree at the level of the individual departments, certainly. However, in the White House itself, of course, at the NSC, at the National Economic Council, that I think is becoming more important, you know, you have Vice President Pence. You have a somewhat different situation, and that's moved a little more rapidly. That's just a caveat to a point. The general point, I think, is well taken.
So we're at about the half-hour mark, and I think we should, at this point, pivot to China, which is obviously a big topic and could eat up the whole time, but we won't do that. So at least as a sort of casual observer of the U.S.-China relationship, I personally was surprised by the Trump-Xi summit, and given all of the strong statements leading up to it and the drum beating about the tougher line, I think it seemed rather surprising how peaceful that went. My focus these days is on trade, and I think one of the remarkable things, as we've seen over the last week, is that President Trump is now speaking much more harshly about Canada than he is about China on trade, where he seems to have sort of stopped talking about it at all, really. Although that, of course, could change again. So I want to sort of address the U.S.-China relationship under Trump from multiple angles. I suppose maybe starting with the economic, looking a little bit at the one China policy and security and defense. And so, I don't know, Wendy, do you want to start on the economic side?
Yeah, but can I just go back to your previous question too,
Sure.
and just talk a little bit on the economic front, because I think there we haven't seen a lot of key positions filled, including the USTR, who's finally will get marked up today in committee, and that's really important. But I think in most of the economic agencies, you have the cabinet secretary, and then you have the career staff. And if you think about what I mentioned at the outset, we have a 100-day process for coming up with a package of deliverables with China. We have a 100-day process going on with our trade deficit study, where the administration's looking at 13 countries, 2/3 are Asian countries that have significant trade deficits, and trying to come up with recommendations on what to do there. We have a national security import investigation on steel, and the list goes on. And when you think about the lack of people between the senior people in the ministries and then the career people, it's hard to see how this is all going to move forward smoothly. And I would just also add, including with respect to the State Department, we haven't seen a lot of ambassadors nominated either. Right. Yeah. And that's really important, particularly as a lot of foreign countries are trying to figure out who do they meet with, who do they express concerns to. So I'll add that.
All right, and so now let's pick up with China, and let's start with the China economic relationship.
Okay. So my view, this is one area where I was pleasantly surprised by the outcome of the Xi Jinping-Trump summit. I was, number one, I was really impressed that quickly this administration could develop a structure for engagement with China, not only on economic issues, but on other issues. As someone who's worked, for previous administrations, those kind of discussions can get bogged down. You can spend months deciding, where's the box and who's going to talk to whom. And the fact that that was done quickly, I think, is very positive. That means that this team is ready to move from process to substance. So I give them a lot of credit on that front. Now, on the trade front, they've come up with this 100-day plan of action. And I know both sides are working hard to see what can be announced, what can be agreed to in the first 100 days. That doesn't mean the process is over in 100 days. I think the idea is that you get meaningful deliverables so you can build the momentum going forward. And I think that's really important, the momentum going forward, because I think in the U.S.-China economic relationship, we really need to start having an honest discussion on the fundamentals, the underlying problems in the economic relationship, whether it be the issue of state-owned enterprises, subsidization of emerging industries, localization policies, et cetera. So while short-term deliverables are important, I would hope that this dialogue doesn't, just focus on that.
And let me just, if you don't mind my reviving a comment that you made to me in previous conversations, but I think
Which
is
was
interesting.
off the record, right?
Right, okay, this is all off the record, this part. I mean, even as somebody who had worked on this under the Obama administration, my sense is your impression was that in some ways it would be constructive to take a somewhat harder and more direct line under this administration.
Yeah, and also just take a step back. I think during the Obama administration, particularly in the economic relationship, by the end we were getting to the point where we were just making incremental steps. And I think this is a really good opportunity for everyone to kind of just take a step back, look at the real issues that not only are the issues of today, but the issues of tomorrow. And I know, for example, that the issue of like automotive tariffs has been raised, and people are concerned. We have a 2.5% tariff on autos. China's a 25% tariff. Let's bring those, let's make them even, or let's, ask China to reduce its tariff to 2.5% or zero. And I would hope that we would just take a step back and take a more kind of comprehensive look about how we're going to deal with an emerging auto industry in China, and how there will be a level playing field established. Based on my experience in negotiating autos with Korea and Japan for years and years, the Japanese tariff went down to zero during our trade talks, and lo and behold, we found a whole slew of non-tariff measures. So I think we have a great opportunity now on some of these emerging issues and some of these really underlying issues to really take a fresh look and try and come up with meaningful kind of long-term solutions, durable solutions to these issues.
Wendy used a phrase, issues of tomorrow, which strikes me as tremendously important, and she's the real specialist on this. But the one thing I would add, and it was in some of the Chinese proposals, I'll bet you'll see this in the, quote, 100-day plan, is the whole question of e-commerce that Jack Ma presented to President Trump earlier. How is e-commerce going to evolve across the Pacific? What are the implications for us, for our companies, for Amazon, as well as for Alibaba and some of the others that are major players there? It seems to me that whole issue is one that is beginning to dawn.
Oh, please, go ahead.
Well, I think that I agree with the comments that have been made about the surprisingly positive aspects of the recent Mar-a-Lago summit between Trump and Xi Jinping. People were obviously expecting things to go much more rocky, especially since Trump himself said he thought they would before the actual event. And I think the idea, he believes he's established a relationship, a rapport of some kind with Xi Jinping. And I think that there is a desire to have cooperation to try to address the issues, the differences between them. And the Chinese, I think, are also very cognizant of the fact that they want to try and avoid having any kind of blow up in the relationship, particularly in this critical year. As somebody else mentioned, they're looking at the party Congress at the end of the year. They're still very focused on a lot of their domestic issues, and that'll last for a long time yet. And they're concerned about trying to deal with the North Korea situation. So I think there's an opportunity there to establish a greater degree of understanding. The problem is, what is it connected to in terms of a strategy for stabilizing the Asia-Pacific in particular over the longer term? I was interested in what Senator Gardner said about having a 40-year perspective. I mean, that's like 40 years is way out there. I've tried to take a 25-year perspective in looking at Asia, and I think the countries involved need to start thinking in those terms much more, because what we are seeing in Asia is a fundamental transformation in the environment, economically and militarily in particular. And I think there needs to be more consideration given to the idea of working with the allies and then with the Chinese to establish a stable balance in Asia, a genuine balance of power. The Trump officials have said that their main emphasis in their Asia strategy is going to be on working with the allies. It harkens back to the inside-out approach that was prevalent when Richard Armitage was in government, Bush administration, and Bush won. And the idea that you really work a lot on your allies and then your relations with the Chinese and others will fall into place. I think the situation today is very different from that situation in the past. And I don't think that a strategy that focuses on the allies as the priority is necessarily going to be the most effective strategy. You have to have something that's going to be very clear about how the allies in the U.S. fit in with the Chinese, and not just in terms of getting leverage on the Chinese to try and make them do what you want.
Yes, please, Josh.
Yeah, if you recall, in the early years of the Obama administration, the Indians in particular were petrified that the United States was developing something like a G2 condominium with China, that the United States would get together with China to delimit their respective spheres of influence in Asia and call it that. I think in the later years of the administration, the Indians and others took some assurance from the fact that the U.S.-China relationship actually turned out to be, quite complicated. And part of that reassurance, however, was the U.S. investment in regional institutions or regional architecture in Asia. And this mattered even to the Indians and other countries in the Indian Ocean. Looking at the U.S. investment in ASEAN, the ASEAN architecture, in APEC, and also in the many-lateral constructs, the U.S., India, Japan architecture, and others. And so I think, those were not institutions that were about managing China explicitly or directly, but they played a very significant role in helping the U.S. manage and shape the rise of China. So India and others, I think, are looking in this new administration, in an administration that has proclaimed an interest in bilateral engagement more than multilateral engagement. What's the role for these other kinds of architecture, for the U.S. investment in ASEAN, for the U.S., India, Japan relationship? And will there still be avenues to engage China in that way? Or I think their fear looking at the Mar-a-Lago summit was that there might be a trend back toward the United States and China trying to divvy up Asia in a sense. And that's very anxiety producing for countries throughout the Indian Ocean.
Yeah, the Xi-Trump summit to me sort of reminded me of when Sherlock Holmes asks Watson, "What do you hear?" And Watson says nothing, and he says, "Precisely." Because it was the fact that nothing actually really happened that was the most surprising thing. Of course, the missile strike on Syria is the thing that happened most significantly out of that summit. But given all the expectations of what was going to happen going in, and Trump has been, I think, pretty clear about his thinking, which is going into it, he thought the trade with China was the most important issue, and he came out of it thinking that North Korea was more important than trade, and so he was going to put trade on the back burner, and they've now bought themselves some time with these 100-day plans and reviews and stuff like this. I think the thing to watch out for is once these reviews and everything are complete, and they all come out flagging China as a culprit, and on top of that you have China having not solved the North Korea problem, I wouldn't say that we should expect that things have just sort of ratcheted toward the undramatic in the U.S.-China relationship based on the past few weeks. I think we could be in for an upending where the trade stuff really does come back on the fore, where there's no more sort of hope that China is going to somehow solve North Korea for us, and then we're sort of back in the mix.
Good for Canada.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Canadians will.
So let's talk a little bit about Taiwan. I know we have a number of folks in the audience who have a strong interest in that, and so I wanted, if I could ask one of you to decode, first of all, what's happened on the one China policy in Taiwan, and also to look ahead on what are other issues coming up with Taiwan, particularly regarding arms sales.
I was in Taiwan a few weeks ago, and I think they've been through a bit of a roller coaster when they overlay our politics on top of their politics over the past year or so, because since President Tsai took office, the Chinese have asked the Taiwanese to embrace the so-called 92 consensus formulation on cross-strait relations. She has declined to do this, and so they've started to use economic tools to try to coerce an outcome there, in particular reducing the number of tourists by about 60%. They go from the mainland into Taiwan. So that has been sort of the backdrop, and they've been sort of wrestling with how to do this and whether to find a formulation that would work for both sides and all of these other kinds of things. And then in comes, President-elect Trump, who has the first phone call with the Taiwanese president and looks like he's walking away from the one China policy, only to walk back to the one China policy and to not have another phone call, and sort of describe the phone call as just a courtesy call and everything else. I think that the Taiwanese they seem to have both a big appetite and hopes that the administration can deliver a major arms package and so forth, but also a pretty significant fear. And that fear gets to this transactionalism and to the emphasis on trade. They don't want to be part of some deal on where, you know, Taiwan is traded for autos or something like that with China, or, you know, some trade thing like that. They want to be sort of dealt with on their own terms, as they have been up to this point. And, you know, if they are part of a broader transaction is, I think, unclear to them and really to everybody else right now.
I agree with all that. I think that the Trump administration clearly, they were driven early on by Trump's notions about one China and his tweets, which tended to put enormous uncertainty into what the U.S. policy is and how it might change, whether it might change. And there's been correction, as just mentioned, in all of that, with a reaffirmation of the one China policy. Although Trump gave an indication that he reiterated the one China policy sort of as a favor to Xi Jinping, which still sort of gives you a sense that he still sort of looks at it as something that could be transactional. Maybe not now, but perhaps in the future, which of course I think would be catastrophic for the relationship. The Chinese nonetheless have taken his words now as being a strong indicator of a consensus between the two sides about the fact that there is one China, et cetera, that provides the foundation or the floor underneath the relationship. But we still have the possibility, as somebody mentioned, of a arms sale. I mean, it's a likelihood, not just a possibility. And the question will be how large that is, when it's done, and what, if any, kind of political dimensions there are to it vis-a-vis the Chinese. Now, the United States has never discussed with the Chinese the idea of providing assistance to Taiwan. It's part of one of what's called the 6 assurances, that you don't treat with or discuss with the mainland defense assistance to Taiwan, which, by the way, is not an American ally, despite what Senator Gardner said. And so you have that uncertainty about whether or not the arms sale package will, in fact, be used for political purposes. And I don't expect it will be, but I think there still are some real uncertainties about that issue.
So we have about 10 minutes before we open things up to the audience. I wanted to turn to Japan. And Ken, why don't you kick this off by telling us what are the opportunities and what are the risks for Abe in the new U.S.-Japan relationship?
Well, I think clearly an opportunity is the personal relationship that he established very early on, during the transition with the President Trump, and that's continued on since then. The question is, what does this mean? Except for some golf equipment and the other things that they exchanged. I think this really depends a lot on staffing and the extent to which the administration will concede to some people that I think do have credibility on both sides of the Pacific, as well as the fundamental question for American policy generally as to how to trade off macro-related issues, growth, exchange rates, capital flows, and the sectoral issues, of course, a Japanese agricultural market that hasn't fully opened, although there have been some steps, various regulatory issues that are certainly significant. Obviously on the industrial side, how our auto industry and other key industries evolve. I think there's some opportunity that the current structure of the discussion and probably the principles that are involved in this, namely Vice President Pence and Vice Premier also, that structure and then the combination of macro, structural, micro, and cooperation. We've seen things below the surface or informally on cooperation, but it hasn't ever really, to my knowledge, been a clearly presented element of the overall relationship. So there's, I think the early start was a plus. There's something to build on in terms of the configuration of the agreements. There could be over expectations. I think that's a big danger. This is not the 1980s. The capital flows from Japan are not a deus ex machina that allows the United States, as the Reagan administration did to contract huge deficits and do huge macro stimulus. Just partly because Japan, I don't believe today, is capable. Much of its financial system, the insurance company and so on, is more liberalized than it was in those years, and so the flows are more market-oriented. They can't just open the floodgates and let huge amounts of capital flow across the Pacific in the same ways. And if that is what the administration's expecting, I don't really think that's going to happen. It's complex. There are a lot of subtle elements. Certainly there are trade issues remaining. But I think there's been, to echo what Wendy said on China, I think there's been a start that certainly is a lot smoother and potentially constructive than many of us saw a few months ago.
I have a theory which you can please feel free to shoot down. But on the security side, that Prime Minister Abe actually sees Trump as a real opportunity to do what he has wanted to do for a long time in terms of building up Japan's military and to expand Japan's role in the region, both because the U.S. is encouraging it and because of the sort of madman unpredictability that it helps him domestically to say, look, this is a moment where Japan maybe can't rely on the U.S. as much as it used to. I wonder if you or others see that and whether that, again, is opportunity or whether that is risk for destabilizing the region.
Well, I think generally Trump's strategies in a lot of dimensions are high risk, potentially high reward. And on the U.S.-Japan security relationship, I think there's that dimension, and Abe is buying into it. Take, for example, the Carl Vinson on its voyage northward toward Korea. It has a couple of ships in the carrier convoy from the Japanese Marine Self-Defense Forces. And this has gotten a lot of play on NHK television, and I'm sure the Abe administration is happy about that. That's a symbol, a signaling to the Chinese, I think, that this is not the same approach that's been followed in the past. And it's both stimulative and, it could be deterring as well.
Wendy, I threatened at the beginning to raise TPP, and so we can't turn things over to the audience without going a little bit through TPP. Talk a little bit, we know that Trump has withdrawn. Talk about what the implications are in that through the region, and what do you think are the prospects for some kind of maintenance, if not revival?
Okay, so once the U.S. withdrew from TPP, the other 11 TPP countries started to discuss among themselves, well, what do we do now? And as a result, Chile hosted a meeting a couple of months ago where they invited not only the TPP countries, but they also invited Korea and China to join to talk about regional economic integration more generally, but also the prospects for concluding TPP without the United States. For technical reasons, it can't be the same TPP because the entry into force provisions of TPP would have required the United States and Japan to be part of the group. But they're non-technical ways. They're ways that they could conclude the agreement among themselves, and that's the conversation they're having. I think in another week or so, the officials from the 11 countries will be meeting in Canada to continue this conversation. And then at the ministers' level, they're going to continue the discussion on the margins of the upcoming APEC trade ministers meeting in Vietnam. Where this will lead to, it's unclear. I think countries like Australia and New Zealand see a real value in trying to go ahead and do this. Other countries, perhaps Vietnam and Malaysia, may have some questions in terms of whether this deal is worth it without the United States in it, given their interest in market access to the U.S. market. The key country in all of this, I think, is Japan. And it's very interesting that just about a week or 10 days ago, Japan indicated an interest in TPP-11. And so I think that introduces a dynamic where there may be some prospect for continuing the conversations and maybe going ahead with TPP-11. But I think that will be very difficult to actually put TPP into force among the 11 countries. This administration has made it very clear they're not interested in regional agreements. They prefer the bilateral route with respect to trade negotiations. And I think a lot of countries in Asia now are wondering what this means for them. Clearly, the administration has said NAFTA is going to go first, and I think we should expect very shortly that a notification letter will be sent to Congress, which would start a 90-day clock under Trade Promotion Authority for launching negotiations with NAFTA. And then the question will be, who's next? And many are speculating that perhaps it may be Japan. Because without TPP, this administration, will want to have economic engagement in the region. Why not do it with a country like Japan? I think this raises a lot of questions and concerns for Japan, paramount of which is we signed up for the TPP, we got it through the Diet, we wanted a regional agreement. And second, if we were going to enter into bilateral negotiations with the United States, what does the U.S. want in a bilateral deal? Does it want us just to do the TPP, what we agreed to in TPP? That's one option. But if they're going to come back and ask us to do more on agriculture, to do more on autos, and maybe put currency disciplines in the agreement, I think that's going to pose some very serious challenges and could actually, affect the overall relationship going forward.
Right.
Go ahead, Ken.
I think that's that there is that danger. What is the United States going to be looking for in the bilateral? That's up in the air now. The most recent Pence visit to Japan, I think, suggests the issue sort of being kicked down the road. Or Vice President Pence was the first summit was somewhat conciliatory. The second one, newer issues that looked like they could be additional demands on Japan were raised. So that's a question. What will the configuration be? Will it be more than what's already been settled on TPP? I think the political likelihood is that it might very well. It could be balanced by the cooperation basket, though, which I think is also potentially productive.
Okay. Thank you. If nobody else on the panel wants to jump in on that, I'd like to open it up to the audience. If you have questions, raise your hand and wait for a microphone. We've got two right there. If we could start with those, and then I'll make sure we get around to the other parts of the room as well. Two right there. Please make sure to identify yourself.
Hi, I'm David. I'm a student here. My question goes back to North Korea. I was wondering if you guys can paint a picture of what a U.S.-led military intervention will look like. What's the priority? Is it regime change? Is it neutralizing the nuclear warheads? Thank you.
And actually, just give the microphone to the gentleman in front of you. And we'll answer this first, and then you can go next. So who wants to paint the war game?
Well,
that's good.
The United States has presumably planned for all kinds of contingencies that involve military force of some kind. I don't know if I want to say the expectation, but I guess the assumption in many cases is that any kind of military intervention, there's generally two types. One is direct attack on presumed nuclear weapons sites and facilities. More along the lines of a kind of a surgical strike that would take out those facilities, or just take out a launch as it's occurring, or in flight. That's the other alternative. The problem with all of these is you don't know what North Korea's reaction would be. You're tending to, if you were to resort to that, you would assume the North Koreans would see that as, boy, they really mean business, we need to cooperate. I'm not sure, in fact, I don't think there's much evidence that the North Koreans would take it that way. And so then the argument becomes, if you really want to not be on your back foot, you have to do more than just attack nuclear sites. You have to eliminate the artillery along the South Korean border because they can hit Seoul. And if you're talking about all of this, you have to get South Korea's approval for doing this. The worst possible thing the United States could do would be to exercise some kind of, as they say, kinetic option against North Korea without getting the approval of the South Korean government, which has given no indication that it would support that. So, unless there are some very deranged people in the Trump administration, we could debate that. I doubt very much there's going to be a military attack on North Korea, at least in any near-term time frame.
Anyone else want to jump in on that question? Okay, okay. What is it? The silence is the significance there.
I would just add, we also have an upcoming Korean election.
Exactly, and we have a Korean election here.
There'll be a new president in a couple of weeks.
You've got two candidates who, right now both seem to be viable. Neither of them have indicated that one of them has already said, I want to restart the six-party talks. I want to start getting us back on the road to negotiation. So they're not thinking attacks.
The only thing that I would add to that is the issue of preemption. If some sort of North Korean major attack were imminent in a way that seemed to be or verifiable, or there was a strong probability of that,
yes,
there would be strong incentives, I think, and also we have a combined forces command in Korea and a U.S. four-star with a direct relationship to the Pentagon in Seoul. So the whole process of response is quite efficient from that perspective. So preemption, I think, is a possibility that we can't ignore.
All right, yes, sir, please.
Yeah, I think, Richard, you mentioned the fact that...
Identify yourself, please.
Oh, sorry, Nirmal Ghosh from the Straits Times. Richard, you mentioned that the chances of North Korea actually giving up its nuclear weapons is basically pretty much close to zero. And Dr. Swaine, you also spelled out an alternative to a war which everybody agrees would be catastrophic. You said there should be negotiations, perhaps, negotiate a freeze and a cap, and then some sort of agreement. When can this sort of conversation be taken on board and start, in an American administration or also in public sphere in the U.S., given the extreme rhetoric right now and the sort of, war calculations and so on that we hear? And also keeping in mind the fact that a lot of parallels are being drawn with Iran, but isn't that a false parallel? Because Iran didn't have nuclear weapons. It was stopped. Now the horse is bolted, right? So I'd just like to hear your thoughts on that. When can this sort of conversation start? Thanks.
Well, others may know, but I don't have a clear sense that there is a long-term game plan here in the Trump administration. What's plan B? If China tries to put pressure on North Korea relents for a period of time, and yet it doesn't in any way agree to relinquish its nuclear weapons, and I agree it's highly unlikely. The Trump administration has said they're not interested in a freeze. And yet, they may end up with that as the best case. And so the question becomes, how do you transition to that in a situation where if you've laid out this red line in the sand, the Chinese are, the North Koreans cannot have a nuclear-armed ballistic missile. The U.S., many have said the ICBM. I think that's extremely unfair against the Allies. It's not an ICBM. It's a ballistic missile that can reach Japan or South Korea. I mean, that should be the concern of the United States. People talk as if North Korea acquiring an ICBM, oh boy, that's the red line because it can hit the U.S. And just imagine the impact of that on the thinking of the Allies. So you have to have some notion here that you can put a freeze on this process at the very least. I think that's what the Chinese are probably hoping to maneuver the Trump administration into doing, and then hope that they can work from that into something where we can get a real negotiation going with the North Koreans, where it may be open-ended as to whether or not they're actually going to agree to denuclearization, but they're agreeing to sustaining a freeze. And then you can talk about trying to get to some kind of cap. Now, what I guess I'm saying is that the Trump administration, I think, needs to get to that point through events that we have yet to see occur.
Go ahead.
I'll just add, well, as an American, the notion of Kim Jong-un getting an intercontinental ballistic missile that can hit the continental United States armed with a nuclear warhead actually is a significant concern. I don't think that's just equivalent to their ability to hit Japan or South Korea. I think it's one step beyond that. And as Americans, I think we should be honest about that. But I think the comparison on Iran is inexact for the reasons that you said. Iran didn't have to give up nuclear weapons because it didn't have them. It just had to. It gave up, in material, but it had to, and then it bought 10 years or 15 years, depending on which portion of the agreement you're talking about, of time before it can go to industrial strength enrichment program again, legally under the agreement. I think the thing that folks focus on when they talk about the Iran analogy is the coercive economic tools that were employed. So the real sort of magic of the economic sanctions on Iran was not the United States sanctioning Iranian entities that wanted to do business with the United States and cutting off those entities from the U.S. market, because there wasn't a whole lot going on. It was sanctioning third entities that would do business either with Iran or with the United States, forcing them to choose either to have access to the U.S. market or the U.S. banking system or the Iran, and the choice was obvious in almost every case. That isolated Iran economically. It's still inexact because Iran is not an isolated society, and it's a middle-class economy that is relatively large and that wants to buy things from around the world, and that clearly does not apply in North Korea. But we have not taken the kind of coercive economic steps on third parties, with the exception of Banco Delta Asia back in 2005 and all of that we have done with Iran.
Could I just add one thing?
Please.
I think one of the dangers of this situation is creating a false red line about the current situation. That red line would be a test, another test. Most specialists that I've spoken with and read about believe that the North Koreans are not anywhere near getting an ICBM, and probably not near getting even a shorter range missile that has a miniature nuclear warhead that you can put on it. So in that sense, there is still time in order to deal with this problem. What I worry about is that Trump and the Trump administration thinks at some level that what distinguishes itself from everybody else who've gone before them is that they're willing to really get tough if the North Koreans give an indication that they're still moving in some way, which would be a test. Or if they try again to test a longer range missile, that is some kind of red line that beyond which you can't go. Therefore, we have to really act in extremis at that point. And I think that sets up a situation, it's a recipe for real disaster. If the United States, what are the options? I mean, what are the options under those kind of conditions?
All right, we've got a lot of questions. I promised the gentleman back there to next. Please wait for the microphone. We just have the one mic, I guess, so we'll go around after.
Thank you all very much. I'm Lauren Hershey. I've been an observer and traveler in Asia for 51 years. I'm still trying to get a handle on things. You've defined complexity here, and you've given a lot of clarity to us, so I'd like you to come back at the second 100 days or next year at this time, please, and offer your thoughts. I don't think I heard, I left the room for about 3 minutes, addressing the role, if any, of Russia and Vladimir Putin. I'd like your observations on that, and also your comments on the use of the Security Council, or the utility, if you will, of the ambassadors visiting here in Washington yesterday. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Who wants to take those on? Go ahead.
I guess I'd just say briefly, after all, North Korea has two neighbors. China's one, Russia's the other. Kim Jong-il, was very concerned about relations with Russia. And North Korea has played the two off. If somehow Russia were cooperative, and that's a big if in this kind of a process, it could be significant.
I mean, and sometimes in the foreign policy circles, in the more angst-ridden days when you wring your hands and can't sleep, people worry about a Russia-China axis forming against the United States. And of all the problems in the world, I don't think that should be one that's at the very top. I mean, certainly Russia and China can do things to either be a party of no and push back against what the United States would like to do in multilateral fora, which they do at the United Nations, like a biological function now, and other things like that. Or they can do joint exercises in the South China Sea to show that no tribunal is going to tell us what to do and that kind of thing. But in terms of a positive agenda, I think, or an axis forming, I think that is highly unlikely. The one thing to watch, I think, though, is the Japan-Russia relationship, because Prime Minister Abe seems to think that with better ties with Russia, including some economic inducements, he'll get some sort of administrative control or something other than the Kuril Islands. Kent may know far better than at least I do about the possibility of that actually coming to fruition as opposed to being a massive disappointment. But given where we are with Russia on the one hand and given how close we are with Japan on the other hand, that has a chance to at least put a small monkey wrench into how we deal with these countries.
Please, Josh, go ahead.
Oh, if I could just add, one other domain in which Russia's actions are increasingly malign is in the Afghanistan-Pakistan arena. And this has really bubbled to the surface over the last few months in U.S. public statements, as recently as yesterday when the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs and General Nicholson had their press conference in Afghanistan, essentially talking about the provision of support and material to the Taliban by the Russians. And the Russians have begun playing the same kind of game in Afghanistan that the Iranians have played for some time, hedging their bets. But they've also been playing a broader diplomatic game and taking advantage of the lull in U.S. engagement over the transition to host a number of conferences about Taliban reconciliation, to bring in the Pakistanis and others. The Pakistanis are looking for new friends and partners now that the U.S. support and engagement has pulled back. So this is an area where the Russians are increasingly engaged, and there's growing concern by the United States, publicly, by the Indians and others, as to the sort of really counterproductive activities they're doing and the sort of unhelpful legitimacy that they're providing to the Taliban at this stage in the conflict.
There was a question, the second half of his question was about the meeting with the United Nations ambassadors yesterday. Does anyone want to address that or have any observations on the value of that? No observations on the value? Okay. There's a question in the front row. Let's take that one next. The mic's coming from over there.
Irish Shaw, Taiwan DPP. Although Taiwan is not the U.S. Security Treaty allies, but we do have a 38 years of commitment to the Taiwan relations. And also, Taiwan is closely linked to the U.S. regional allies in trade, security, supply chain, you name it. So can we use TRA as a leeway to discuss what a more proactive role the Congress could play to provide more reassurances to the region in times of uncertainty? Thank you.
Who wants to take that question?
I mean, TRA is the framework under which U.S.-Taiwan relations take place, and Congress has a disproportionately important role in Taiwan relations relative to the kind of relations we have with other countries in the region. And I think the near-term way we're going to see this manifest itself is in an arms package. Where the Congress comes down on the arms package and where the administration comes down, but also, frankly, where what Taipei wants in such an arms package. Does it really want to, as they say, build fighter jets and submarines at home and have sort of prestige weapon systems in the face of China's anti-access area denial and rocket capabilities, missile capabilities, or does it want to put its money and have an arms package that's more focused on dispersion and autonomous systems and things like that? All of that remains to be, I think that's really the near-term conversation that needs to happen between Taipei and Washington. Once there's an agreement to move forward with some sort of arms package, what's going to be most meaningful in terms of Taiwan's defense?
Yeah, I would
Please, go ahead.
You want a minute? I would agree with that. I think it's a mistake to look at Taiwan as part of a larger strategic assessment about the security environment in the Western Pacific. The Taiwan issue for the United States is very much a particular issue that has to do with balancing, right, between providing support for Taiwan under the Taiwan Relations Act and many, many years of close relations with that island, as you've pointed out, and not doing things that are going to create such instability in the U.S.-China relationship that it really is non-productive both for both countries and for Taiwan. And that's always a balancing act in U.S. policy. But it is not helped, in my view, if Taiwan is regarded as a kind of strategic enclave that the United States can use as a kind of card against Beijing to try to increase its leverage. I mean, this is actually one issue that can become very problematic if you start linking things, which is what Trump has already indicated he's willing to do, which we've already talked about. The Chinese, in some respects, in the past, I should put it, the concern of U.S. officials in the past has been you don't want to use linkage in your policies because the Chinese would like to link things to Taiwan. They'd like to link a U.S. position regarding assurances on Taiwan to other things that they would possibly not do that would be to the benefit of the United States or whatever. And that is not a game that, in the past, U.S. officials have wanted to play.
We have a question here in the fourth row, second seat in. Let's start with that, and then we'll work our way back.
Thanks. Jack Capperell with Inside U.S. Trade, and this picks off a little bit, or where we just were, but in terms of linking trade and security in North Korea with in the U.S.-China relationship, I mean, is there concern on anybody's part that China will just kind of pocket concessions and make small, meaningful moves on North Korea for as long as they can? So, in terms of the big picture, is this good trade policy? And then would a better approach have been to use the stick instead of the carrot at the outset and, pressure them on trade until they made meaningful progress on North Korea?
Want to start?
Yeah, I mean, we kind of addressed that earlier, but just in response to your question again, I mean, I don't think it's useful to make the linkage between, security issues and trade issues. I think both on their own merits are very important. Trump was elected, partially on his trade agenda and, leveling the playing field. And if the signal he's sending by saying that we may go easier on trade if China cooperates on North Korea, I think, is an issue that would be of concern to the people who put him into the White House. I also just feel that statements like that can lead to a lot of misunderstandings because what China could deem as cooperation on the North Korea front, which could be very different than what the White House has in mind, and what China deems as going easier on trade or getting a better deal on trade could be very different than what the White House has in mind.
Okay. There was a question, I think, in the back row. I'll give the microphone runner a bit of a break there. Go ahead.
My name is Anastasia. I'm a visiting fellow at Davis Center, Harvard University. And I would have a question about trade policy that the U.S. will have, because now it's uncertain, so we don't have TTP, but will there be some substituted formats with other names but TTP content? As if I understood it correctly, you mentioned that the current administration would focus more on bilateral formats, but what we see in Asia is the development of multilateral formats. I mean, One Belt, One Road project, RCEP, etc. So how you see this link and connection between new current administration trend and what is happening in Asia Pacific? And another question would be about India and Pakistan joining Shanghai Cooperation Organization. How do you see this, the future of this organization, and how? What is the so how it would fit, or what would be the connection with U.S. security priorities in the region? Thank you.
Okay, do you want to, when you start that, and then Josh?
Yeah, so with respect to your question on TPP, In light of this administration withdrawing from TPP, I think it's really incumbent then on countries in the region and the U.S. as well to find ways to keep the TPP standards alive, either through other agreements, bilateral agreements that they conclude among each other. I mentioned earlier, maybe the TPP 11 go ahead and put the agreement into force. But also, and here I would note with great interest, Vietnam and Malaysia, they've already announced they're going to put some of the TPP reforms, they're going to go ahead with them unilaterally just because they think they're in their own national interests as they look to grow their economy and attract foreign direct investment. So I would hope that we would see these rules show up and live in through other mechanisms. I was also welcomed the draft NAFTA letter that was, I guess, leaked, which also showed that in many areas the administration may be pursuing TPP standards with respect to digital trade, with respect to state-owned enterprises and other issues. With respect to the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, I think that's a very important negotiation that's underway. It's among 16 Asian countries. The United States is not part of it. China and India are. It's entering its sixth year of negotiation now. They're working hard to conclude these talks by the end of the year. They're facing a lot of challenges, including challenges with respect to rules on investment, IPR, and services, but also with respect to tariff negotiations among different groupings in this negotiation. We'll have to see whether they will be successful in concluding the negotiation by the November meeting of ASEAN. It's the 50th anniversary of ASEAN. There's going to be a lot of pressure to announce success on the RCEP negotiations. And I think that if the parties work hard in the lead up to that meeting, they may be able to define success and announce success.
Josh, on the APEC.
Let me just say something on the trade piece and then on the SCO. I think many of us were probably very pleased to see the White House announce that the president would be going to a number of the Asian multilateral events later this year, including the APEC Leaders Summit. And I think there's an open question, what's he going to do there? What's the agenda going to be, particularly given this focus on bilateral trade engagement? What's that focus going to be? And other countries are going to be looking at this closely as well. Probably high on that list would be the Indians. There were fierce battles waged during the Obama administration about whether the United States would support India's membership in APEC. And eventually we settled with great boldness on the mealy-mouthed language that the United States would welcome India's interest in APEC. So this is something that was under debate within the U.S. government, but there's also been sort of different camps within the Indian system. And the Indian view saw APEC more as a geopolitical club to be joined. And under the Obama administration, so we saw APEC as a forum to ratchet up standards that would then show up in other settings. So I think the Indians will be watching closely not only what the agenda is for APEC, but whether this presents an opening for them to think about membership or greater engagement in that forum. With respect to the SCO, I don't think very highly of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. There's not a lot of there. I think on the positive side, it's done something to help engage some of the Central Asian republics in more cooperative approaches to counterterrorism. Central Asian republics tend not to be very cooperative and multilateral in general. They're very suspicious of their neighbors and of the regional powers. On the downside, because of China's involvement, it's focused, I think, disproportionately on Uyghur militant groups that may or may not exist, and has really sort of had a very strong focus on China's parochial interests. So I think there's some value to it. I don't think it's something the United States has been too concerned about or should be, and it's something that could over time evolve to actually involve information sharing that could be tied into to wider information sharing with the United States or other partners.
We have about 5 minutes, maybe 2 or 3 questions. Let's take one from this side of the audience. Gentleman right back there.
Thank you. My name is Jiwan Huang from South Korea. I'm now the visiting scholar at the Catholic University of America. My question is about the follow-up question on the U.S.-China relations on North Korea. It seems to me that the Trump administration is more interested in the North Korean issue than the Obama administration, but it's good to hear about that. But I'm wondering if the Trump administration is ready to risk U.S.-China relations for the North Korean issue, because if the China does not cooperate, then there would be more tension between the U.S. and China. So, thank you.
Thank you. Who wants to pick that up?
Well, I mean, President Trump has said we really want to have China's assistance to deal with this problem. But if they can't do it, then we'll do it alone. And then he's defined alone as we'll do it with everybody else except China. And that to me indicates that, and then he said a lot of other things that are very positive about the relationship, and very positive about President Xi Jinping. And he believes Xi Jinping genuinely wants to try and really cooperate in dealing with North Korea. So at this point in time, all of that to me doesn't add up to Trump's about to sort of put the U.S.-China relationship at risk in a fundamental way if they don't meet certain objectives on the North Korean front. And again, those objectives seem to be getting North Korea to agree to denuclearization up front. And if he thinks that that is the realistic objective and that anything less than that that the Chinese might bring, such as a freeze or a cap, is simply unacceptable, then who knows? He might resort to something tougher if he thinks the Chinese need to be pushed further. But at this point, it doesn't sound like that's the case. It sounds like if he doesn't get what he sees from the Chinese, and the Chinese might, I think the Chinese are quite possibly come back and say they're not going to test for a while, missiles or nuclear tests. Now, I wouldn't bet on that, but they could come back and say we think that they won't do that. I mean, Xi Jinping has apparently told Trump, we don't have any political influence with the North Koreans, but we do have economic influence. So it's really a calculation on the part of the Chinese if they can use economic sticks in some way or incentives to get some kind of temporary agreement from the North Koreans, and whether Trump will accept that as good for the interim, at least for the short term.
Okay. Let's see, we have questions on this side, over in the front row on the side.
Hello, I'm Mia Seidel. I'm an intern at NHK Japan Broadcasting, and I actually have a question for Mr. Schlesinger. You mentioned that Prime Minister Abe might use this administration as an opportunity to possibly remilitarize Japan. My question is, do you foresee this actually happening in the near future? And considering that the U.S.-Japan security alliance has been seen as the cornerstone of Japan's diplomacy, how would this affect the future U.S.-Japan relationship?
Actually, I probably should let Ken answer that, but just to clarify, I don't think I was saying that remilitarize Japan, which is a kind of loaded phrase, but certainly that Japan would play a much bigger security role and that you would see an expansion in Japan's security role. But I'm going to kick that to you.
The only thing I would agree with all that, just add, of course, now we have collective self-defense under legislation passed by the Diet and strongly supported by Prime Minister Abe. That's allowing for new forms of cooperation under the alliance. What we just saw about the Carl Vinson and the ships accompanying it from Japan, I think represents incremental change in defense policy. I think that's right, and Prime Minister Abe wants that. Whether it really goes beyond that into unilateral actions, I think is unlikely. I don't see that.
Let's take one more question, I guess, right in the back there.
Hi, Edmund Sim. I teach at National University of Singapore. I wonder if participants could comment on the U.S. relationship with ASEAN as an institution, i.e. the Secretariat, et cetera, and with the individual members. I mean, you don't have to go through all 10, but just some of the major folks like Thailand, Philippines, Vietnam, Indonesia. Thank you.
All right, who wants to take that? The one thing that I guess I would say is that Singapore, it's an interesting decision, one of the few ambassadorial decisions that seems to have been made. Katie McFarland, Deputy National Security Advisor, going to Singapore as ambassador. I think there's appreciation. Singapore's defense budget's larger than Vietnam. It's played a key role, of course, in putting ASEAN first, but I think there's eyes on Singapore in any case.
I would just add, I think the fact that Vice President Pence included a stopover in Indonesia as one of his 4 stops in Asia underscores this administration's interest and hopefully commitment to work with ASEAN going forward, coupled with, as mentioned earlier, the announcement that the president will not only attend APEC and EAS, but ASEAN as well.
And I think, Wendy, again, sort of picking up on one of the off-the-record things that you had told me earlier, I think that another interesting focus on the change in the Trump policy, as you mentioned, was Vietnam. That the withdrawal from TPP actually does put an interesting element on that relationship.
And I've heard, people speculate, after they speculate about Japan, whether this administration will approach Vietnam to seek a bilateral agreement. And that might be interesting because in the TPP negotiations, Vietnam was very interested in access to the U.S. Footwear and apparel market. And so they have, given that strong interest, they found it was their own interest to be more flexible on some of the high standard rules that the United States was pushing in TPP. So that might be an interesting, perspective negotiation to watch.
All right, well, thank you all very much, first, for an excellent audience, an excellent set of questions. Please give a round of applause to our fantastic panelists.
Welcome you all to this event, and I'm also very honored to welcome Representative Joaquin Castro as the keynote speaker for today's conference, the first 100 days of the U.S.-Asia relations under the Trump administration. Representative Castro represents the 20th Congressional District in Texas. He hails from San Antonio, graduated from Stanford University in 1996, and from Harvard Law School in 2000. At the age of 28, he was elected to the Texas legislature. Actually, that's extremely impressive because that's often the age at which our students just are graduating from SAIS. Now, while a state representative, he created the Trailblazers College Tour, personally raising money to send underprivileged students to college visits, exposing them to some of the nation's best institutions of higher education. Representative Castro also founded a literacy campaign and a book drive that has distributed over 200,000 books to more than 150 schools and shelters across San Antonio. During his time in Congress, he has sought to build out what he calls the infrastructure of opportunity: good public schools, great universities, and a sound healthcare system to enable his fellow citizens to pursue the American dream. First elected to Congress in 2012, he serves in House Democratic leadership as Chief Deputy Whip and a member of the Democratic Steering and Policy Committee. He is currently a member of the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence and the House Foreign Affairs Committee, both roles deeply entrenched in the strategic importance of Asia to American foreign policy and national security. Furthermore, as founding co-chair of the U.S.-Japan Caucus and the Congressional Caucus on ASEAN, Representative Castro has valuable insights into the current state of U.S.-Asia relations. At Johns Hopkins SAIS, we value intelligent, constructive, and forward-looking policy leadership. Today's speakers have offered us exactly that, and I look forward to more dialogues like the one we've had today, where we push ourselves to be action-oriented and thoughtful about the balance of power in the world. And I can think of no better capstone to this event than a discussion with Representative Castro a community and political leader, and a rising star in the democratic politics. Representative Castro, welcome to Johns Hopkins SAIS. It's our privilege to host you here today. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Thank you. Thank you to everybody. It's wonderful to be here with you. And Dean, you're right. I was elected when I was 28 years old to the Texas legislature. And on some days in Congress, I think perhaps I should have gone to graduate school instead of starting politics. But thank you for that kind introduction. And thank you to everybody at Johns Hopkins SAIS and the Asia Society for putting together this program that included Senator Gardner and the experienced insights of such a distinguished panel. To Wendy Cutler, who just recently left 30-plus years of government service. It's great to see you. Thank you for all of your work on behalf of our nation. I'd also like to offer my deepest thanks to Sharon Yanagi for all her work in planning a thoughtful and timely event. Thank you. To all of our hosts, thank you very much. And to all of the students and faculty and others who are here who do so much great work in this area, thank you for everything that you do. So I'm Joaquin Castro, and I'm in my third term representing the city of San Antonio, my hometown, in the House of Representatives here in Congress. I currently serve on two committees, the Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence and the House Foreign Affairs Committee in Congress. And so I'm grateful to not have to talk today completely about Russia, which on most days I do. As some of you may know, members of Congress are able to create and join organized groups called caucuses that seek to increase members' understanding of specific issues and increase discussion of those matters on Capitol Hill. So I'm the founding co-chair of two bipartisan Asia-focused caucuses, the U.S.-Japan Caucus, which is going on about 4 years of service, and the Congressional Caucus on ASEAN, which is just a few months old. Both of these groups are growing and include members from all over the United States, both Republicans and Democrats. I think the diversity and size of our membership indicates how much interest and enthusiasm there is in Congress for fostering strong ties with our partners in Asia. We're here today to examine the first 100 days of U.S. policy towards Asia under the new president, President Trump. But before I get into unpacking President Trump's Asia policy, let's understand just how invested the United States is in the Asia region. Australia, Japan, the Philippines, South Korea, and Thailand are all U.S. treaty allies, and over 63,000 troops are deployed in the region. 5 of the United States' top 10 trading partners last year were Asian countries. Asia is home to the United States' nearest competitor in economic size and military strength, China, as well as the world's most populous democracy, India. Moreover, 5 nations in Asia have nuclear weapons programs: China, Russia, Pakistan, India, and of course North Korea, which carried out 2 nuclear tests in 2016 alone. President Obama pursued an Asia policy that meaningfully deepened U.S. engagement in nations there, with nations there. For example, he and his administration were instrumental in China committing to carbon emissions reductions and signing the Paris Agreement on climate change. He took the U.S. relationship with ASEAN to new heights, engaging a bloc that has enormous significance to our nation. The 10 member nations play a critical role in supporting a peaceful, rules-based international order in Asia. And U.S. exports to ASEAN support more than 560,000 American jobs. This year, we celebrate ASEAN's 50th anniversary, as well as the 40-year anniversary of U.S.-ASEAN relations. President Obama elevated the U.S.-ASEAN relationship to what is called strategic partnership status, appointing the first U.S. ambassador to ASEAN and hosting the U.S.-ASEAN Summit in Sunnylands, California. The Young Southeast Asian Leaders Initiative engages nearly 100,000 young people from all 10 ASEAN countries, and the U.S.-ASEAN Connect framework is helping ASEAN achieve an innovative and dynamic integrated economy. The Trump administration, most of all, must build on this progress that was built by his predecessors. So I was glad to see that Secretary Tillerson met with ASEAN ambassadors to the United States earlier this year, and it's very encouraging that he'll be hosting ASEAN foreign ministers in Washington this very week. I'll be meeting with ambassadors from ASEAN nations tomorrow and look forward to reiterating our nation's commitment to the region and to them. At the close of the Vice President's trip to Asia, he announced that President Trump will participate in the U.S.-ASEAN Summit and East Asia Summit, a standard the previous administration started. This moment, in particular, is a critical time in the Asia-Pacific region. The North Korean nuclear and rhetorical threat has escalated. South Korea will elect a new president in May. China is militarizing the South China Sea. And the Philippine president's erratic behavior and conflicting statements are difficult to decipher. Asian nations, including U.S. allies, are involved in maritime territorial disputes in the South China Sea, the East China Sea, and the Sea of Japan. At this significant time, the United States would best serve itself and the global community by demonstrating leadership through the stability of thought-out policy and the steadiness of diplomacy. However, I think most people will agree with me when I say that stability and steadiness are not the two words we think of when we think of the Trump administration so far. While Congress plays a role in steering our nation's foreign policy, it's the President and his administration who set the primary direction. Under President Trump, it's been challenging to gain a clear picture of our direction in our foreign policy, what direction that foreign policy will take in the months and years ahead. I know that this event is meant to assess the administration's first 100 days, but I think in order to do that, we also need to consider the posture the President took before he came into office when he was running as a candidate. In contrast to the amorphous Asia policy of President Trump, candidate Trump had a very clear vision of how the United States would treat Asia. All of us here can probably recall the rhetoric that the President used. He insisted that he would put America first, lambasted China as a currency manipulator, and harshly criticized the Trans-Pacific Partnership, even suggesting that our basing agreements in Japan and South Korea were not cost-effective, and that those two countries should consider or might consider developing nuclear weapons on their own. So you think about where we started. In a minute, I'll talk about where we are now. Not long after the 70th anniversary of the Second World War's end, then-candidate Trump denounced many of the multilateral institutions created in the post-World War II era that have been the backbone of U.S. foreign policy for decades. Collectively, these comments suggested that Donald Trump would significantly change U.S. foreign policy, particularly in Asia, if elected. After the campaign's conclusion, he showed his willingness not only to shift U.S. policy, but also deviate from his own prior statements. This was a time when his views on Asia began to be less predictable. In a high-profile meeting, he assured Prime Minister Abe that the United States was committed to ensuring Japan's security, for example. But he then agreed to a phone call from the President of Taiwan, a major departure from decades of protocol, throwing into question whether the U.S. might change the underpinnings of U.S.-China policy. It was especially troubling that the President behaved in this haphazard way during the transition without the benefit of consulting the State Department at all. Since January 20th, the President has continued to take brash action on what seems to be an ad hoc basis. The hostility President Trump has shown towards longtime U.S. economic and security partners like Mexico and Australia has created an opening for China to exert greater influence on the world stage. He's also changed his tune on China's currency manipulation, recently saying, quote, "They're not currency manipulators." With regard to trade policy, the President's decision to withdraw from the TPP was also a sharp departure from the previous administration's priorities. And to this day, the administration has yet to put forward ambassador nominees for critical posts after recalling all of our nation's top diplomats without lining up any replacements. Ambassadorships to ASEAN, South Korea, and Australia remain vacant, and his nominees to Japan and China have yet to go through the confirmation process. These posts, along with many other top positions in the Department of State, need to be filled as soon as possible for America's engagement with our nations, ally nations around the world, and others to be effective. Gaffes and policy reversals may be part of the expected evolution from candidate to president, but the President and his team must make a concerted effort to adjust the weight of their new responsibilities and lead accordingly, particularly when it comes to formulating and implementing U.S. policy toward Asia. Let's take a moment now to consider more closely some of the Trump administration's dealings with the region, specifically in Northeast Asia. As I mentioned, on the campaign trail, the president often used the region as a foil in his speeches in a way that, quite frankly, felt more like a throwback to the 1980s than the reality of the present. Japan, in particular, bore the brunt of many of those unflattering statements. To Prime Minister Abe's credit, Japan has arguably navigated this particular transition quite well. And since his inauguration, the president has taken a friendlier approach when speaking about this important, long-standing, and strategic ally. This constructive engagement with Japan is understandable, considering our nation's key security partnership and extremely strong economic relationship. Japan is the second largest source of foreign direct investment into the United States, pumping over $400 billion a year into our economy. In the administration's first 100 days, the president hosted Prime Minister Abe in Washington and Florida, and Secretary of State Tillerson, Defense Secretary Mattis, and Vice President Pence have all visited Japan for high-level discussions. In each of those meetings, U.S. leaders not only reiterated our treaty commitments to Japan's security, but also emphasized our security commitments to other allies and partners in the region, commitments that President Trump had called into question during his campaign. So despite the aircraft carrier mix-up last week, the administration has decidedly taken a hard-hitting stance toward the Kim regime and their continued advancement of a nuclear weapons program. After North Korea's missile test during Prime Minister's visit to the United States, our military deployed the THAAD anti-ballistic missile system, which had its own controversies in the region. We on the Foreign Affairs Committee in the House of Representatives responded as well, passing bipartisan measures to tighten our economic sanctions, including enhanced maritime interdiction measures against North Korea, and condemn the regime's development of multiple intercontinental ballistic missiles. But the administration's actions in Asia don't exist in a vacuum. It remains unclear how the Asia-Pacific region will interpret a review of the Iran nuclear deal, for example, that Secretary Tillerson has said is forthcoming. Any steps to undo an agreement negotiated by the United States, the EU, and countries that make up the UN Security Council are bound to undermine diplomatic efforts to rein in the actions of a rogue regime in North Korea. The administration must keep that at the top of its mind as it considers the effectiveness of the JCPOA. There is no doubt that the United States remains completely dedicated to defending our allies in Asia. What's less clear is how our economic engagement with the region will move forward after the United States withdrawal from the TPP. We can assume that the President and Vice President are laying the groundwork for bilateral trade agreements, but we haven't seen any details of what that might look like yet. Now, all in all, President Trump's stance toward the Asia-Pacific region is a marginal improvement to that of candidate Trump. What's not encouraging is that the United States President's attitude and policy towards strategic allies like Japan and Australia could swing so wildly in just a matter of 6 months or so. We're seeing a similar shift take place with the President's view towards China. Other than Secretary Clinton, journalists, and immigrants, one of the most frequently vilified entities on the campaign trail was China. Fast forward to 2017, and now President Trump sees areas of possible cooperation with China. Meanwhile, tensions remain high in the East China Sea over the Senkaku Islands, and Britain and France have begun freedom of navigation operations that continue to take place in the South China Sea. Will President Trump turn on China again if conditions deteriorate in those areas? How will he strike a balance with the Philippines when it comes to managing these maritime disputes? These are extremely consequential questions for the United States, for the region, and for the world. A point I alluded to earlier when mentioning Iran and North Korea, but want to make clear, is that the entirety of the Trump administration's foreign policy decisions affect conditions in Asia. This is extremely true when it comes to China. Every piece of U.S. foreign policy affects China's role in the world, not just U.S. policy toward Asia or China specifically. Any U.S. withdrawal from the global stage will be an opportunity for China to exert its influence. Whether in Central and South America, Africa, or other parts of Asia, China will fill any vacuums the United States leaves, either intentionally or due to an oversight. The Trump administration must keep that in mind as it talks tough about renegotiating trade deals like NAFTA. Our economic and security actions in any part of the world will prompt reactions from Beijing, without a doubt. Now is not the time for drastic cuts in our diplomatic efforts at the Department of State. We cannot afford to cede our leadership and influence on the global stage. The administration must proceed with caution as it continues to set its foreign policy priorities in every region, or risk enabling the accelerated rise of China. As I said earlier, in these consequential times, the United States must be an unwavering leader. Yet the President has not provided that kind of steady leadership in his first 100 days. He's flip-flopped on a host of issues on foreign policy positions that impact Asia. What's unsettling is that at a certain point, unpredictability can be interpreted as instability and untrustworthiness. Indeed, in my visit to Japan and South Korea a few months ago, the most frequent question I got from legislators was whose word they could trust, who could speak for the White House and the President. On any number of issues, not only in foreign policy but also in domestic policy, depending on who you talk to at the White House, you can get 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 different answers to substantial and significant policy issues. We cannot continue for the next 4 years with that as the operating method. We never want to reach a point where the nations of the world do not believe the United States will stick to its word, follow through on our promises, and adhere to our guiding principles of the past 7 decades. It's understandable that a new president would experience growing pains as he assumes the role of leader of the free world. No job or previous experience can fully prepare any person to be president of the United States. But it's time for President Trump to rise to the occasion and get serious about the responsibility he bears as leader of the free world. What steps he takes to mitigate the North Korean threat and promote the United States' economic engagement in Asia hold tremendous importance, yet we don't have a clear sense of what those policies will be. He has the responsibility to deliver thoughtful, complete, concrete plans for Americans and our partners overseas. And yes, sometimes that means our government's analysis must go beyond simply dollars and cents. For the sake of our nation's prosperity and for the stability and security of the entire world, I hope he swiftly fills the critical foreign policy vacancies that remain in his administration and proceeds with an informed, measured strategy rather than simply impulsive bravado. I'll certainly be doing everything that I can to strengthen our nation's relationships with our friends in Asia from my position in Congress with my colleagues. So thank you again for having me here, and I look forward to speaking with you at greater length during our discussion. Thank you.
Oh, I think Chris for the microphone, sorry.
Okay.
Well, thank you very much, Representative Castro, for your insightful remarks. The Congressman has agreed to take a few questions, and so I'll turn the mics over to the audience. Can I ask you to keep your questions brief, introduce yourself, and only ask one question? Okay, let me see some hands. Yeah. Wait, can you wait for the microphone?
We get the microphone coming. Yeah.
Hi, Congressman Castro. Peggy Chang with Voice of America China branch. Tomorrow, the 100 senators are all called into the White House for a briefing on North Korea. What's your thought on that? And Secretary Tillerson has said that all options regarding North Korea are on the table, including military options. And what's your thought on that? Thank you.
Okay, we can take a few other questions at the same time. Yes, in the back.
Thank you very much, Congressman Lauren Hershey. You didn't come here to address our relations with Mexico, but you're fairly close to the border there. You did talk about China taking advantage, or any rival or adversary taking advantage of our missteps. What is it with the wall? Where is this going to go? What's your prediction? We won't hold you to it.
Thank you, especially in these times, right?
And can I get a question from a SAIS student?
Any students?
Oh, don't be shy. Okay, any other questions then?
Nirmal Ghosh from the Straits Times. Congressman, you mentioned you meeting the ASEAN ambassadors. I mean, Secretary Tillerson is going to be meeting with the foreign ministers of ASEAN on May 4th, I gather. Are we seeing the beginning of a more focused and greater engagement with ASEAN? And could you give us a little bit of insight as to what's been behind it? Thank you.
Thank you. Is that enough?
Sure, yeah, that'd be great. All right. All right, let me try to go through them here. First, the senators visiting the White House. I think that's a positive development. The White House should work more collaboratively with Congress, obviously with the Senate in this case, on foreign and domestic policy. Let me tell you what I mean by that specifically. For about the first 6 weeks of this administration, Congress was missing in action. The President issued executive order after executive order, none of which involved the United States Congress. During the previous administration, not only the Obama administration, but administrations before, significant policy decisions such as the ones made by executive action or executive order would not have been made without Congress demanding that the President consult Congress on those issues. And so I see it as a positive thing that the senators are going to go consult with the President, particularly on an issue like North Korea, which I imagine they'll be speaking about. I've not read the full news reports on their meeting, but I suspect that's going to be a big topic of conversation. The President has also, President Trump has criticized, and the administration have criticized what they described as strategic patience by the Obama administration. There is, of course, a frustration, not only by the United States and our allies, but by the world, that North Korea could be the next nation to fully develop nuclear weapons. But reckless aggression cannot be a substitute for strategic patience. There has to be a comprehensive, thorough, and well-thought-out plan for approaching North Korea. And my concern so far is that I have not seen one. And I would dare say that no one else in Congress has seen one yet. So I look forward to seeing that plan, to consulting with the administration where they're willing to talk to Congress, and to being part of a strategy for the United States. The second question on Mexico and the wall, and I did mention in my remarks that you all know that the State Department has gotten proposed cuts in the President's budget of somewhere between 28 and 31%. Fortunately, a President's budget usually never becomes law. That's the sunny side of this. But I do think that it will serve as a benchmark for the majority budget, in this case, the Republican budget. And so we have to be mindful about the devastation that it could have on our diplomatic relations around the world. Just today, for example, as I was preparing to come here, I saw a news report that said the administration would like to combine the State Department and USAID, roll USAID into the State Department. So you see some of these very significant policy changes that this administration is undertaking. With respect to Mexico, the reason I mention that is because there's also been talk of forcing Mexico to pay for a border wall. I believe that the border wall would be an ineffective strategy and a waste of money. It is a 17th century solution to what really is a 21st century challenge. Also, because even before this administration took office, border crossings had hit a 4 decades low. And so the strategy should be one of technology, of manpower, of other resources besides a wall. I think that's why you see both conservatives and liberals, Republicans and Democrats out in Texas and other border states come out strongly against a border wall. But to the point of aid on Mexico, and this is my last point on your question, I believe that whatever monies the United States and President Trump take away from Mexico, Xi Jinping and China will be more than glad to go to Mexico and offer them whatever we take away. I see this as an opening for China to accelerate its rise in Latin America. In some of the ways that you see, China has formed deep relationships, significant relationships on the African continent. And what I've told folks in Texas, Texas is, by the way, the largest trading state in the nation. Texas does more trade than any state in the nation. Texas's #1 trading partner is Mexico. Mexico doesn't have to buy all of its stuff from the United States or from Texas. They can start to diversify where they get their goods. And my fear is that this hostility, trying to force Mexico to pay for the wall, being derogatory in other ways, will drive or repel Mexico and other countries to find other trading partners and other allies around the world, including, most of all, China. Now, I don't want to be misunderstood about this. The United States should have a good relationship with China. We should work with China where we can. That's very important. But China is an economic competitor. They are an economic competitor nation. And I would prefer to see American goods sold to Mexico than Chinese goods. The third question, the foreign ministers and ASEAN, again, keeping with my comment about meeting with more members of Congress, I think the Vice President's meetings with the foreign ministers is a positive one. I think President Trump attending the ASEAN summit is going to be positive in the fall. We should strengthen our relationships among the ASEAN nations. They are important economic allies of ours and also important allies in the Asia-Pacific region, particularly in these unpredictable times.
With that, thank you very much.
All right.
And you join Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, and if you can all stay seated for a minute as Representative Castro exits, I just want to thank everyone for coming to our joint event with SAIS. Once again, can you wait for the Congressman to leave? I want to thank you for joining us for our joint event with SAIS. We are very pleased with the turnout. We also want to thank Senator Gardner and our earlier panel. As we have discussed, the Asia-Pacific region is very important, both in terms of strategic interests and economic interests, and how the Trump administration engages on these issues is very important going forward. We have seen some positive developments on this front, but we also know that there are serious challenges on the horizon. It's unclear how this is all going to work out, but what is clear is that U.S. plays an important role in the region. And with that, let me conclude the event, and thanks again for joining us.